Living in a cabin in the woods, splitting your own firewood, sitting next to your own wood stove, living a more simple, close to the earth type of life. With the cost of living today and housing, the idea of taking out a 30-year mortgage to own a home right from the beginning and to pay the utility costs and insurances and heat and lights, etc. that go along with a large home, a lot of us just come to the conclusion that it's not worth the rat race for that kind of luxury. Just imagine the freedom of starting from nothing and building a small cabin out of pocket and having your housing expenses completely covered before you ever get started in life. To not have to make a mortgage payment, but rather enjoying a place that you already own outright because you've sacrificed a little bit initially in comfort and luxury to build a place out of pocket, piece by piece, so that when you move in, it's completely paid for. That's a lot of freedom. It's a lot of peace of mind. My name's Dave Whipple, and over the last 20 years, my wife Brooke and I have built up 3 different Alaskan homesteads, always starting from raw land and roughing it, living in a tent while you build, and putting 100% sweat equity into a place right from the ground up. If you love the thought of living in a cabin in the woods, but never really understood the costs involved or how to go about it or what that process would look like, I hope this video helps to outline it. Now, this is the first cabin that Brooke and I built. It took us about 3 months to build it, and we lived in it for 2.5 years. We learned a ton, and it was a very simple, peaceful lifestyle. Let's start right from the beginning and show you guys how we made this happen. Let's start with land. This is the first piece of property that Brooke and I bought that we built on. This land was just under 2 acres, and it cost right at $6,000. Now, when you buy raw land, you're going to have probably 25 to 35% for a down payment. You can't get around this cost, so you might as well start saving right now. The realtor who sold us this property actually owned it himself, and it was $1,000 down for us to move onto the property. I believe we paid 9% interest, with the idea that we were going to pay it off as soon as we possibly could. I'm pretty sure by the end of the summer, we'd had this place paid for. Now, when you build a log cabin, there are certain things that you're going to have to buy. Windows, roofing, nails, etc. But for a lot of the cabin, the log walls in particular, you're either going to buy the logs or you're going to cut them off your own property. We were lucky in the fact that there was enough downed timber on this property to start with that we didn't have to pay for any logs. Cost of logs, $0. Counting up all the lineal feet of the logs that we had available on the property, we determined we could build a 12-foot by 12-foot cabin with all the material we had, hence the size. As opposed to renting while we built, we lived on the property in this 8x8 tent. I think the original cost of this tent, about $80. Now, for the floor of the cabin, we bought dimensional lumber from a local sawmill. This is all rough cut lumber, so it's full 2 inches by 6 or 8 inches. And the flooring planks, they're all a solid 1 inch thick. Cost for all the flooring, about $220. That includes nails and joist hangers. Brooke and I both went to Alaska Industrial Hardware, and we each got a heavy-duty draw knife, $35 a piece. Our friend Neil Eklund gave us this chainsaw. It's a Homelight Super XL. We used it to build the whole cabin. Now, the saw was free, but we probably used 3 or 4 chains, a couple gallons of bar oil, and probably 10 gallons of gas, a couple files. So when it's all said and done, I would say we had $100 into all the chainsaw work in this cabin. Now, the 4 corner posts are from one big log, and they're all a quarter of the log. We had a sawmill put that big log on the mill for us and cut it up. The total cost for the log and the sawing, $50. Other tools we needed, like a pry bar and a sledgehammer, we already owned, but if you didn't, they'd run you about $20. A friend of mine poured these big concrete discs that ended up being our foundation. He gave them to us for free. Now, you cannot overstate the value of an outhouse. If you live in an off-grid cabin, you have to have an outhouse. This particular outhouse was built out of 2x4s and T111 siding that was already on the property when we bought it. Cost of building the outhouse? $0. One of the benefits of buying a piece of raw land and building on it and living on that property is that you can take your evenings and trim brush and cut firewood and really dial the property in and make it beautiful. Some of the best memories I have at this time were burning up brush in the evenings and listening to the radio. Now, log screws are an expense you can't get around if you're building with log. I believe I spent about $250 on log screws to put this cabin together. Now, once we made it to the top of the log walls, I had to flatten out the last log and put on a top plate, which was just a rough cut 2x6. From here, I could start setting the rafters on top of that nice, flat, smooth top plate. Between the boards that I bought for rafters and the boards that I bought for top plate boards, I had about $140 into all the framing for the roof. Once I started putting OSB on the roof, I believe I ended up with 12 sheets of OSB, and at that time they were running about $8 a piece. All the log work that you see me doing up here on the roof is actually just decorative. It's just so you could see a log from the inside of the cabin. Now, by the time I got the metal roofing on, when you add up the cost of the roofing and the roofing screws, the ridge cap, the OSB for the roof, the rafters, and the top plates, I had about $400 into the entire roof system. And that T111 that was on the property originally that we used to build the outhouse, there was enough left to sheet the gable ends of the cabin. Cost of the roof without insulation, about $400. Now at this point, we put a deck on the front of the cabin where the front door was going to be. Now that deck wraps around a spruce tree, which was also kind of an interesting little feature. With all the wood, screws, joist hangers, and plank decking, I think there was about 200 into the deck and the steps. We got some used cedar shake shingles that we used to cover up the gable ends. They didn't cost anything, but they sure looked great. Now to do the wood stove installation, I put a piece of linoleum down that covered the entire floor of the inside of the cabin. And then I poured a concrete pad that the stove itself was going to sit on. I just used bags of pre-mixed mortar cement mix and used stones from the driveway. Very simple. I also bought one sheet of cement board that you would use for tile, and I used that for a heat shield behind the stove. Now when you add to that the stove itself, which we bought used, the one piece of triple-walled insulated pipe that goes through the wall, the two flanges, the two elbows, the little china top that goes on the very top of the chimney, and 5 sections of stovepipe, all told, between the linoleum, the concrete base, the heat shields, the stovepipe, and the stove itself, we had about $300 invested. Now when it comes to furnishings, we built the shelves. We bought most of the furniture, either used or it was given to us. Every single window in this cabin came from the local dump. We made the front door. The countertop also came from the dump, and of course the cabinets are homemade. By the time we wrapped up this cabin project, the only thing we really had left to do was insulate the floor and insulate the ceiling and put a board lid inside the ceiling. Those were the biggest expenses in finishing the cabin. All told, about $300 between the insulation and the boards to cover the ceiling. Brooke and I were both working all this time. She worked at Chena Hot Springs Resort as a recreation director, and I worked in Fairbanks as a cement finisher. We managed to pay for this property by about August of that summer, and at that point we were completely free and clear. Not only was the cabin paid for, but the property was paid for too, at a grand total of $7,970 for 2 acres and a cabin. Not only that, but our property taxes were only $120 a year. Now, I can't think of a better way for a young couple to start out in life than to own something outright and have next to no bills as far as living expenses. Now, I understand there's a lot of hardship that went into this. We had to physically build this cabin in our spare time. And we also lived in a tent until we got the roof on this cabin. That's not exactly comfortable living. But on the other hand, by the time we were done, we owned it completely outright. Add to that a cabin like this is pretty much zero maintenance. Even when it's 50 below zero, you could leave for weeks on end with no ill effects to the cabin. Living simply in a small cabin like this afforded us so many benefits. We had extra time and extra money to travel and to go fishing and to enjoy the wilderness of Alaska and actually to live without the crushing weight of a mortgage and the relentless pressure of punching a clock and just scraping by paying bills. We had put ourselves in a position where many of the things that people work and struggle for, we had already covered just by changing our perspective, being willing to suffer a little bit and get our hands dirty. By the time our daughter Belle was born, the cabin was pretty much too small for 3 of us. And this next building project, we had to outlay some real cash. We put down Typar, which is a road building fabric, and had a whole bunch of crushed rock brought into our property. The plan was to build a 2-story log cabin next to our original log cabin. Now, we did not have the equipment to do our own dirt work, but we did everything else ourselves. And by this point, I was actually a cement contractor. So we poured the concrete foundation, and then of course the wooden framed floor is the same as it was before. But to get out of the ground this time, it cost some real money. Another one of the big differences this time around is that we had to buy logs. The property we owned did not have this kind of timber, so we bought these logs from a local mill at about $2.50 a lineal foot. The cost of all the logs involved in this cabin was somewhere in the ballpark of about $5,000. You also got about another $750 for the upstairs floor. On this project, we also ended up spending about $1,000 on our roofing. We ended up spending about $1,000 on drywall, probably $2,000 on insulation to insulate the roof and the floor below it. Not to mention probably about another $1,000 for screws and fasteners. The windows and doors were bought used. Some of the furnishings were homemade. The porch probably cost an extra $1,000 on top of everything else. Not to mention we had bought 2 acres on either side of our original property, which gave us roughly 6 acres total. Best thing about that is we knew that no one was going to build next to us. Following year, 2004, was the worst fire season that Alaska had ever seen in history. Over 6 million acres burned. Now, if you consider there were 600,000 residents at the time, that's 10 acres for every man, woman, and child. On this channel a lot, I get people talking about I should replant trees and that burning firewood is destroying the environment. Well, nature destroyed 10 acres per person in Alaska in 2004 alone. That means a family of 4 could have clear-cut a 40-acre section of timber and stacked it up for fuel. And we'd be in the same position we're in right now with the result of the forest fires. With the extra 4 acres of property we added to our place, and all the expenses incurred in building the second cabin, we ended up adding $28,900 to our previous total of about $8,000, bringing the grand total to about $36,900 for 6 acres, the cabin, and the guest cabin. Now, we paid for all of this cash in one season. Now, how would anybody be able to do that? Well, we had 0 living expenses other than property taxes living in our tiny cabin. We lived in that cabin all the time that we built the 2-story cabin. As a cement contractor at the time, I was making good money and could put most of it into building materials to get this job done. It was a lot of work right up front. It took a lot of sacrifice, and we put other things on hold that we could have spent that money on. But in the end, what we ended up with was a paid-for homestead. So by the time we wrapped that project up, we had about $36,000 into the 6 acres and the 2 cabins. That's over about the course of 3 years, which roughly equates to about $1,000 a month. It'd be hard to rent a place in that area for that kind of money. And at that point in time, we had 100% equity into it. We owned everything outright. So when we went to sell that place, we got all of our investment back and then a lot of profit on top of that for the effort that we put in. I think this is a fantastic way to go. It does take some sacrifice and it does take some discomfort, and then you get the satisfaction of owning something. I get people that comment on this channel all the time and say, I would just love to live that lifestyle. I would love to live in a cabin in the woods. I would love to just have that peace. I think so many people are bogged down from the rat race of life, and it's so easy to get into debt, and it's so difficult to get out of it. I think that cabin in the woods is just this shining beacon to so many people of simplicity and peace. I just wanted to document how we started out, and the real key to it all, in my opinion, is being ready to rough it, being ready to sacrifice. Then you don't need $50,000 sitting in the bank so that someday you can live a simple lifestyle. You just got to be ready to rough it right off the bat. And then a few months later, you can move into a new cabin that's completely paid for. And that's just a fantastic feeling. So many people tell me on this channel how much they would love to live that rustic
cabin lifestyle, but I don't know that it's very possible to do unless you change your whole view of life, as opposed to saving up to buy this cabin that's going to be peaceful and adding it to everything else in your life. I would say to get out from underneath everything that is weighing you down financially, mortgage and car payments and student loans and whatnot, by unloading all that as much as you can and living in a tent while you build a cabin. I think it's a great judo move financially and just for peace of mind. If you like rustic living and you would like to live in a cabin and you'd like to be out of debt, I think that's a great move to make. Thank you guys so much for watching Bush Radical. My name's Dave Whipple. Be radical, eh? See you soon.